Welcome, everybody, to our Future Tense event on imagining transportation futures with Secretary Pete Buttigieg and some of our talented Future Tense fiction writers. I'm Paul Butler. I'm the President and Chief Transformation Officer here at New America. I'll just give you a little bit of background. And Future Tense is a project of New America, Arizona State University, and Slate Magazine. We explore the impact of technology on society and how we live. We're so excited today for the conversation. Future Tense publishes ideas journalism on this theme and hosts conversations like this one, all under the tagline, A Citizen's Guide to the Future. A few years ago, in alliance with our partners at ASU Center for Science and Imagination, we decided to add speculative fiction to our Citizen's Guide to the Future toolkit. I'm publishing a monthly fiction story and response essay on Slate. Our Future Tense fiction editors wrote in the preface to their first published anthology of fiction, and I quote, "We hope that Future Tense fiction stories help us imaginatively rehearse possible future scenarios and help us get better at recognizing where things could be different, even when they're hard to glimpse. Scientific and technological elites and leaders often present the future as a fait accompli. A good story, though, can help us find a different point of view, to scout out the decision points so that we can muster our resources and act at the right moment." Sounds like a lofty goal on the part of my Future Tense colleagues. And in the real world of Washington policymaking, annual appropriations bills and the like, we ask the question, is there a role to be played by future scenarios derived from our imagination and from our art? And that's the question we want to pose and get into conversation with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who's charged with thinking about how we, the people, and our goods get from point A to point B, not just today, but tomorrow and in the future. Secretary Buttigieg, we're so honored to have you. Thanks for making the time to join us.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Really pleased to be here and really a fan of the work that's going on here. So thanks to New America and Future Tense for having me.
Thank you. I want to jump right in because we have a great panel that will follow our exchange and conversation. And I would love to start with a question and maybe a thought around what happens as ideas get exchanged, what we may describe as in the horizontal. Sometimes the most innovative ideas in design and in process are inspired, they're borrowed from other industries. I think about things like food and beauty, or music and architecture, or automotive and fashion. We often see that kind of exchange across sectors. And I'm wondering, as you do your work about thinking and imagination of transportation, are there industries that you borrow from? Are there sectors that inspire you?
Yeah, it's a great place to begin. First of all, let me offer a reflection, which is it's striking how much of our imagination about the future is centered on transportation, at least in terms of the imagery of it, right? You look at how the establishing shot of a sci-fi show or film, for example, tells you you're in the future. And usually what establishes it is there's different ways people are getting around. There's levitating cars, or there's starships or something like that. And so we've always, rightly or wrongly, had a disproportionate sense that what tells us we're in the future and not the present, or what marks the present as different from the past, is how we get around. But of course, the reality is a lot of the most profound technologies that affect our lives, including, ironically, the most profound technologies that affect transportation itself, aren't necessarily vehicles or what's on board vehicles. So you want to talk about a horizontal translation. One thing to consider is that in the last decade, I would argue the most important piece of transportation technology was not a vehicle, it was the smartphone. I mean, certainly the thing that changed transportation for most of us most tangibly was probably the rise of rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft. They were using the same kind of cars that taxis used and that we used to get ourselves around. But the way in which we would summon them changed. And through that, a different labor model emerged, a different means of getting around emerged, with good things and bad things that came out of it. But it's a reminder of the value of that lateral thinking. I think it'll continue to be the case that communications technology will mean as much to transportation as propulsion technology will. I think increasingly you're seeing automotive companies turning into software companies. And I think it's never a bad idea to look at fields that aren't even exactly industries as such, like film and literature, to recenter our imagination on why transportation matters in terms of its human impact. And that's what we try to focus on here at the department too. We deal a lot with technology, but try not to get absorbed in tech for tech's sake. We try to think of it in terms of how will the deployment of this technology make everyday life different, make it better or worse from the perspective of safety or equity or economic empowerment. Those are the kinds of questions that should be keeping us busy as policymakers. And that can be touched by any field, but certainly I think the humanities is one that arouses our imagination about what it's like to be somebody different than who we are.
Yeah, and I think we won't get into the policy portion of that discussion today, which is maybe, I think, an interesting place for us to stay. And I'd love to go back to something you said, which really also provokes me to think about some of those works of fiction. As you said, they open a lot with these great images that stick with us. I want to go back there and just, as I think about things like the Flintstones, as I think about the Jetsons, the Matrix, Back to the Future, you're absolutely right that these images and stories that involve transportation really do create an impression about the future and the present. I'm wondering if you think about your favorite works of fiction that have transportation elements. What sticks with you? One, tell us what is one of those favorite works that made an impression on you, and particularly in the role that you have now.
Well, look, I came up on Star Trek, and so which is obviously very much about transportation, right? From the shuttles to the starships to that vision of the transporter. That's the first time we see long distance transportation that doesn't involve a vehicle at all. But if you look at where Star Trek was predictive, revealingly, it actually wasn't on the transportation side, right? It was more things like the communication side, especially from the original series in the 60s, the little devices that they use now resemble cell phones. Sensing technology, if you think about a medical tricorder and how that relates to some of the most impressive things happening in life sciences, actually more on the nose than most of what we saw there from a transportation perspective. I do think it's interesting to think about the Jetsons and the Flintstones, right? Both of them, unlike Star Trek with their transporters, have the presumption of the conveyance that moves you from point A to point B. There's the family car. In the Jetsons, it's the flying car, right? In the Flintstones, it's the foot-propelled vehicle. Interestingly, we've moved actually in both directions. We've come to realize active transportation isn't a primitive thing. It's a very advanced thing. And we're doing more with bicycles and self-propelled transportation in that regard. Haven't quite gotten to flying cars yet. But we have seen that what seems to change more than the fact of the vehicle is its propulsion. And as we're moving into an electric vehicle future, that's something to think about. But what even the Simpsons didn't, the Jetsons didn't, we could have a whole other conversation on the Simpsons. What even the Jetsons didn't picture is that, by the time anybody's got a flying car, George Jetson probably doesn't have to drive it. And again, it's revealing that sometimes what matters most is something we weren't really thinking about, which is how we relate to these pieces of transportation technology versus what their physical capabilities, like their speed, for example, actually are.
It's so interesting, and you're elevating something about these works of fiction and stories and time and the compression of time and the elasticity of time, which is really fascinating and brings me to another maybe another area of exploration and just reflection. So much of the work around transportation has kind of a very present, very real, very now kind of need state. We have to get from point A to point B and solve issues that are with us in the moment. And then on the other hand, the work itself, the output of the work, in many cases, bridges, tunnels, if we think very fundamentally about it, has such permanence and such long duration. And then if you think about flying cars, I mean, we're forecasting way into the future. So we have to solve at these very, kind of binary points or wide points, if you will, the very present, the very now, and the very far in the future. How do you think about that? How do you resolve that in your day to day?
Yeah, you've nailed a big question that we think about a lot, because a lot of the things we're building, especially with the new law and the funding that we have in the bipartisan infrastructure package, these are the means to build cathedrals of infrastructure. And the nature of a cathedral is that it takes a long time to complete, and then it's in service for a very long time. We rely on the cathedrals of infrastructure from past generations, right? We're figuring out what to, not just iconic things like the Golden Gate Bridge, but we're figuring out what to do about the Baltimore and Potomac tunnels. They're 149 years old, and a lot of people depend on them right now for our passenger rail travel. Just to give you one example. And so we have to make decisions that are a bit of a bet on the future. And at the same time, we don't want to bet the farm on the future turning out one way or the other. So what I spend a lot of time thinking about is how can we deploy our capital in an agile or nimble way so that some of these decisions will make sense, even if we don't quite know how commuting patterns are going to work in 7 years, let alone 50. But we know that certain things are going to be true. We know that you're going to need bridges to get from one side of a physical barrier to another. We know that we're going to need resources and hubs where people can come together to access modes of transportation, even if those modes evolve. Things like train stations or town squares or transit hubs or airports and ports. So what we've got to do is invest in the things we know we're going to need no matter what, and then create room for other things to happen that might be very difficult to picture. And the best way to do that is to not think about the asset first, but to think about the people that it'll affect first, and to think really big about the effect that your investments are going to have. Give you an example around high-speed rail or any really good rail service. You mentioned getting from point A to point B, and part of the appeal is that if I'm going from somewhere, if I live in Washington and I'm going to Newport, Rhode Island, I might have the option one day of being able to do it on a faster, sleeker train than I do today. But that's true. But what's really interesting about a new rail service is that it might actually change. It might actually introduce a point C to your picture. In other words, it might become possible for you as somebody who works in a given community to live in a different community than you would have otherwise just because that train was there. In fact, over the sweep of decades, communities may come into existence just because a certain commuting option materialized, whether we're talking about a highway interchange or a high-speed rail stop or something else. And so what we really got to think about is not just how we create a newer, maybe better, faster, cleaner, safer way to get from point A to point B, but how the points A, B, C, D, and E change when we make good choices about how infrastructure ought to work. That's the level of thinking we got to invite ourselves to do, which is not always easy, given the, as you mentioned, the world of annual appropriations and immediate state of good repair concerns that are preoccupying a lot of the people who work on infrastructure for a living today.
That's such a wonderful point, that introduction of point C and kind of the emergence of that third point. It really also about the people changing, even who move between points A, B, and C, and a lot of the conversation we've had internally is around not just transportation but mobility, not just physical mobility but social mobility. And I can imagine as you're talking and sharing that reflection that in a lot of ways, that point C could also be a reflection of how the people are evolving as well in terms of social mobility. And we think about equity, as you mentioned earlier, accessibility and affordability.
Absolutely. Look, there's always been a deep connection between social and economic mobility and physical mobility. It's part of why access to mobility is so important, and it's often so politically contested, right? It's not an accident, in my view, that one of the signal moments of the civil rights movement was the bus boycott and these struggles over who got equitable access to transportation, not just the dignified and equal use of transportation assets, but often even whether people were served at all. And, frankly, you see the implications of mobility most dramatically when it is denied. When you see that living in a community that can be a transit desert, for example, in the same way that we have food deserts, impacts the life choices and the economic opportunities of the people who are there. Transportation is empowering, and access to transportation empowers people to reach educational opportunity, economic opportunity, even social cohesion, the ability to gather with loved ones or participate in civic life. These things are deeply, deeply connected. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's always a good idea to think about transportation as a form of freedom.
Yeah, and there's so many works of literature and art, filmmaking that I think bring some of those images to life and really signal and communicate what you're referring to, and this idea and this connection between transportation, mobility, freedom at the other end. I'd love to try something as we move into kind of the last few moments, maybe a couple questions, and do a little bit of a rapid fire round if you're up for it.
All right, let's try it.
Yeah. So in futures planning, we often do this kind of, we're moving from to, as a way of just framing very quickly what a evolution looks like and what a future scenarios look like to do the radical reimagining. So if I give you a from as an example of today, so the rapid fire would for you to just give us a forecast or a quick reaction to what would it look like in the future. So one day in the future, this may be possible. It's not to say that we're actually working on it or that you're actually working on it, but just a way of projecting a possibility. Sound good?
All right, we'll give it a shot.
All right, let's see. So from Mars to
the stars, I guess. I mean, if the Mars is our current destination where we're mobilizing to try to go, it's exciting to think about what the next leap might be. And that's not just getting around our solar system, but well beyond it.
Yeah. So I'll try another one. Thinking about cars and automotive. So from a monthly car payment to
a monthly mobility dividend. And what I mean by that is if we're looking way out into the future, where we have things like, let's imagine distributed energy generation, where you have resources at your house, whether it's a dramatically more efficient, even solar panels and wind resources than we have today, or something we can't even imagine. But just on your, from your home, you can put more into the transportation system than you get out of it through things like energy. So that you would participate in creating so much value, they'd actually get a net dividend on it instead of paying into it on a net basis. Now that's pretty far out. A more intermediate goal might be from a monthly car payment to a monthly transportation payment that's quite a bit less than a car payment that covers everything. And we're actually seeing certain glimmers of this now. So some of the rideshare companies, for example, are starting to look at mobility as a service where you have some kind of interface and it's neutral on whether you're on one of their bikes or in one of their rideshare things or just on public transit or some combination thereof, or it even leads to a train ticket or something where all you do is you tell your smartphone, hey Siri, book me from the street corner I'm standing at to my cousin's house in Louisville. And then Siri figures it out, and you pay once, and it may or may not be a single seat ride, but off you go. That's a vision, I think, that's well within our lifetimes, if not within our grasp.
Could that get us to the stars? Could that monthly dividend get us to the star?
Eventually. I don't see why not.
I don't see why not either. All right, let's try one more. I think you mentioned it earlier when we were talking about some works of fiction. So from flying cars to flying.
Well, look, flying packages are around the corner, so we might start with those. And let's be careful with those. You don't want all the packages flying every which way. But those might well be on our horizon.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for doing that one. We'll think of some more. I just want to maybe wrap up with maybe one final question, which is really the future you, and not you, Pete Buttigieg. So at New America, we think a lot about building the field, and we're committed to building the fields that we work in, the next generation of voices, the next generation of thinkers. And we have many programs that do that work. If you reflect 50 years from now on the Secretary of Transportation, so who'll be sitting in your seat, could you tell us who you imagine might be there? What set of skills would they need to have? What experiences would they have had by that point?
Well, that's a fun one to think about. So if I envision 2072, with some good fortune, I'll still be puttering around watching what the Secretary of Transportation is up to. And the truth is, this is a relatively young department. I should mention that. It hasn't been around for 50 years. So we will not yet have reached the centennial, or I guess it's right around 50 years, I should say. But it was cobbled together after the FAA and the Federal Highway Administration already existed. I think some of the qualities will be the same. I think she or he will need to be thinking about the effect that transportation has on people's ability to live lives of their choosing. And that won't be so different. But I hope the to-do list will be very different. Because in the 2070s, of course, we will have either succeeded or failed on the climate challenge. And there'll be no escaping that we either pulled it off or we didn't. And I try to veer away from the dystopian. So let's suppose that we did. Let's suppose that we here in the 2020s got it right with things like the widespread adoption of electric vehicles and the search for alternative sources of propulsion for the harder to decarbonize sectors like maritime and aviation. That means that one of the big items on my to-do list, which is climate, will have more or less been dealt with by the time someone's doing that job in 50 years. Likewise, right now we're trying to deal with profound inequities in American transportation. It would be attractive to imagine that 50 years from now, that's been done, that the generations now in charge will have seen to that, so that there's very little question of whether you can equitably access mobility to get to where you need to be. But certain things that are on the to-do list now will stay that way. The first, safety. Who knows what things will be regulating for safety right now, but probably more automated vehicles, probably more drone type delivery of goods, maybe jetpacks and flying cars and all that fun stuff. We'll see. But certainly the idea of losing 40,000 people on our roadways, as we do right now every year, will be a grotesque and antiquated thought. Just as is, the idea today that people would routinely be lost to dysentery or something like that. That's another item that we ought to take care of so that my successor in 50 years doesn't have to. But safety will still be top of mind. I think making sure that whatever technologies are around the corner then serve to benefit people will still be top of mind. And I hope that a secretary who will have grown up perhaps in the generation of my less than 1-year-old children, will see as an environment of policy success. In other words, they will have seen the experience of our society deciding to collect revenue and then use it to deliver good results on everything from healthcare to transportation infrastructure. Use that to build confidence in the power of collective action to do good things, and balance the freedoms that are created by government getting out of the way with the freedoms that are created by government doing a good job, and be able to bring that approach to whatever infrastructure needs there are in the future. But I'm doing my best to make sure this funding, which we may not get again for a good 50 years or so, and build things that are in good enough shape that she or he won't have to worry quite as much as we do about them falling apart.
That's a good forecast and a good foreshadowing of, I think, what we are hoping for. And I think gives us a good springboard into the rest of how we'll spend the hour with some of the writers that have joined us. So, Mr. Secretary, we're going to let you go. I know your time is precious. We so appreciate you joining us for this, and really to give us some things to think about in the future. And I love the point of 2072. It's maybe a way for us just to think about and do the work of imagining going forward. We so appreciate your time.
Likewise.
We're going to pass off to our colleagues at Future Tense. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for imagining with us.
Great being with you. Thank you.
Take care.